Let's look at the architecture one more time. As you can see, I'll have to create only 5 APIs as part of this project. There are 2 backend APIs. I have read news articles and add news articles. This upload breaking news, this is a function which would read the data and put it in the Redis database. Then you have read news articles, which is reading from the external API, which is newsapi.org, and it is also reading from the DynamoDB table. And add news article should add the records in the DynamoDB table. If it is a breaking news, then only this function would be called, which will add to the Redis database. Then I have this front-end API, read news, report news, and breaking news. So let me walk you through the program. The first one that I have is report news, and this is blank. This is the front-end API, and its corresponding back-end API is add news articles. So this is the first 2 APIs, the report news, which is the front end, and then add news articles, which is the backend API. Then we have read news also, which will read the news. Again, this is the front end API, and its corresponding backend API is read news articles.py. So this is the backend API. Finally, we have breaking news.py, which is the front end API, and its corresponding backend API is read breaking news. So these are the 6 APIs that I have created, and the remaining ones would be for your exercise. So let's go through these APIs one by one. These are blank. I'll code this shortly, but the backend APIs I have already coded. So let's look at the add news articles. So what am I doing here is that I'm importing Flask and request module as usual, but I'm also importing Boto3 and Redis. The reason is that I'll be using Boto3 to write data to DynamoDB, and I'll be using the Redis module to write to the Redis in-memory database. If we look at the add news articles API, that's what it is doing. It is writing to the DynamoDB table, and if it is a breaking news, it will write to the in-memory database also. That's why I need both Boto3 and Redis library. And then it is business as usual. I'll come back to this piece of code shortly. Now let's look at the URL endpoint, which is add news articles, and I'm allowing only put method here. And this is the function report news. I'm creating a variable or an object which will open the Boto3 class and its corresponding client method. And we are passing the arguments DynamoDB and AP South1. DynamoDB is the AWS service that I'm going to use, and AP South1 is the region where I'll be using this DynamoDB service. So using this particular line from here till here, what we are saying is that we are saying AWS that, see, I'm using your SDK and I want to use your DynamoDB service in Mumbai region. That's what it is doing. Once it is done, as it is adding a news article, how it would be done. So let's say you are a citizen reporter, and then you have seen a crime or traffic violation or something of that sort, and you want to send that to media. What will you do? You must be having the app in your phone. So you'll open the app, either record video or take pictures, and then write something about it and then send it across. So there are multiple data that you have to send across from the app to the backend API. Of course, you cannot send it using query string. I'm not talking about the pictures or the photos, etc. Let's talk about the text message or the description that you'll be writing in the device. So while sending, you'll have to use HTTP body, which I've already seen earlier. Why HTTP body? As I said, that you cannot send such a big record or such a big data using query string. So we'll have to send using HTTP body, and then this backend API will capture that data which is there in HTTP body. And for that we'll be using this request.data variable. We'll not be using request.json or request.text or anything, because we'll have to send the HTTP body, and the only way to send HTTP body using a client API using the data variable, and we'll have to extract the HTTP body content from the data variable, and for that we use request.data variable. So basically the data variable from the request class. Now, before telling you what am I using json.loadS, let me tell you what am I actually doing here. So as you can see, I am trying to extract the data considering that news underscore data is a dictionary variable. So that's what I'm assuming here. So I'll have to store the data in news underscore data variable in such a way that it is a dictionary. But when I get the data using request.data variable, we get it in binary format. So I'll have to convert it in JSON format using json.loadS method. And for this, I had to import the JSON library, and loadS is the method which is used to convert binary data to JSON format. And that's what I'm doing here. And that's why I'm using json.loadS method to deserialize the binary data to JSON data. And once I get it in JSON format, this news underscore data variable becomes a dictionary variable, and then I can use it the way I have mentioned here. Now, again, going back to the app, which is essentially a program running on your cell phone, whatever text you write, whatever input you give, all those would be converted in JSON format by the code that is running in the app, and then it would be sent to the front-end API, which will send to this backend API. That's why I'm using this request.data variable. Of course, in our case, I'll be not using any front-end app or cell phone app. I'll be using Postman tool. And I am populating this news underscore data using whatever data that we have received. And then I have this global variable called data, global dictionary variable, which is getting all the values from news data. So it seems like I'll have to send article ID, article text, article title, author ID, etc. Now these will be automatically populated. The only thing that has to be populated would be the article text and article title by the end user, right? But again, I'll be using the Postman tool, so I'll have to fill everything up. So the data has been captured in a dictionary variable called data. Now what am I doing? I'm using this variable or instantiating an object called response, which is using the DynamoDB client and the put underscore item API. Now in that API, I'm mentioning the table name and the data that you want to send. You do not have to understand what this syntax is. If you want to, you can go through the DynamoDB documentation. But essentially, what am I doing here is that I'm sending or inserting data to the DynamoDB table with these columns: article ID, article text, title, and so on. By the way, in DynamoDB, columns are known as attributes. So this is how we insert a record in DynamoDB. Note one interesting part, that we are not making any connection to DynamoDB, even though DynamoDB is a database. Why that is the case? Because DynamoDB provides APIs rather than connection. So use API to send records to DynamoDB for insertion, deletion, updation, etc. So these are again API based, right? All right. So once this is done, the status code of this operation would be captured in a nested JSON variable called HTTP status code, which will be in response metadata, and it would be in this response variable, right, which we had just used to call this API. If the message is 200, then it's fine, record inserted, or obviously there's an error. If the breaking news flag is Y, which means that it is a breaking news, then this function would be called, the name of which is upload breaking news, and will pass the data variable as an argument. And data variable is nothing but the entire news that you have got from the device. Let's look at the function. It is upload breaking news, and it is getting the data variable here, and we are creating something called a breaking news key. Why we are creating this key? Because let's go back to the architecture. If it is a breaking news, this function would insert the record in the in-memory database, which is Redis. And Redis is also a key value store, but the data is stored in memory, that is in RAM. So that's why I'll have to create a key, and I'll have to pass a value to the key. So that's what we're doing here. We are creating a key using the article channel ID value, then concatenating that with colon, and then the article published at value. These are not the name of the variables, these are the value of these variables. And then I'm connecting to the Redis database using the Redis library that I had imported. I'm mentioning the host name and the port name, and SSL has to be true if you are using Elasticache. And then I'm adding that in Redis using JSON format. Don't worry about Redis as such, just copy this code. Okay, now one thing is that you might have to change this host variable. This is the Elasticache endpoint. And how do I get that? Go to the Elasticache console. This is the Elasticache cluster that we had created, and the endpoint of this cluster is Redis newsfeed blah blah blah. Just copy this and paste it here. This is the only change that you have to make in this particular code. Also, you'll have to change the name of the table here also if you plan to choose a different name. Okay, so if the records are added successfully, then we'll send a message that record inserted in Redis. If it fails, then record insert failed in Redis. These are the messages that we'll send. So this is the backend API for adding a news. So we'll have to call these API from the front end API, which is ReportNews. So let us go ahead and code this ReportNews. Now, just to give you a background, what am I doing in this ReportNews.py? This is the front-end API, and this front-end API would make a call to the backend API, which is AddNewsArticles. And this AddNewsArticles.py would be running in the EC2 instance that we have just launched. So from ReportNews.py, we'll have to call AddNewsArticles.py, which will be in the EC2 instance. AddNewsArticles.py would be running in the EC2 instance, and ReportNews.py would be running in the local machine, in my machine. And from Postman tool, I'll be calling this ReportNews frontend API. So first, as usual, let's add the path app.route. The URL endpoint is ReportNews, and the methods that I'm allowing is put. And now let us go ahead and create the function, which is report_news. The first thing that I have to do is that I'll have to extract or capture the data which was sent from Postman tool using HTTP body. To extract the data that was sent using HTTP body from Postman tool, we'll have to use the JSON variable of request class and not the requests library. Remember, we'll have to use the request class, which is provided by Flask module. So to get that, this is what we have to do. We'll be using the request class and the JSON variable of request class, and I'm capturing it using news_data variable. Okay, after this, I'll have to make a call to AddNewsArticles.py, and this is where I'll be using the requests module. Okay, so let's do that. I'll use this variable called R. You could have used resp also, RESP, but I'm using, let's say, R. And here what I have to do, I'll have to use the requests module followed by the request class. And here I'll have to pass multiple things. The first one would be the method. And what method should I use? If I go to add news articles, I can see that I have allowed only put method. So I'll have to mention put method here. And then I'll have to add the URL. So the URL would be the HTTP endpoint followed by the port number and the URL endpoint. The URL endpoint is add news articles. Now what would be the IP address and the port? Remember that I'll be running this add news articles in EC2 instance. And this is the EC2 instance. I have already copied the code. This is the exact same code that I have created actually, and I'll be running it in this EC2 instance. So I'll have to get the public IP address of this EC2 instance, which is this one, and I'll have to use that EC2 endpoint followed by the port number. I can get the port number from here, which is 10,002, and then the URL endpoint, which is add news articles. All right, so we are calling the URL endpoint. Now, of course, we'll have to pass the data. So how do you pass data? We'll have to use the keyword named data, and then I'll have to pass this news underscore data. But we cannot send it just like that. We cannot send this body to this add news articles just like that. We'll have to serialize it in byte stream array. We did not have to do it in Postman tool because Postman does it by itself. Whenever we send the request, whenever we send the HTTP request from Postman, which has a body of data, what Postman does, it serializes the body in byte array and then it sends it to the API. But here we do not have Postman, so we'll have to do it ourselves. For that, I'll have to use the JSON library. So I'll have to import the JSON module. So once it is done, the command that, or the class rather, that I'll have to use is json.dumps. So now the news data, which is actually in dictionary format, would be serialized in byte array and then would be sent over the network to the EC2 instance. So if the status code is 200, then you are okay. If the status code is not 200, then of course we are not okay. So what I am saying here is that if r dot status code equal to 200, then we'll be sending this message that news reported, or else we'll send this message that news reporting failed. And as it is a view function, I'll have to return something. So let me return the message data that I have just created. Okay, I can't write return, it seems. Anyway, okay, so this is ready. So what I have done, let's recap one more time. I have added this as new add news articles. What it is going to do, the URL endpoint is add news articles and it is allowing only put method. I'm creating a Boto3 client and I'm telling the SDK that I'm going to use the DynamoDB service in AP South 1 region, that is Mumbai. And after that, I'm extracting the data, or I'm deserializing the data that has been sent by ReportNews.py. Now we know that ReportNews.py would be sending the data by serializing it. So we'll have to deserialize it. But we get the data using request.data variable. Why that is the case? Because while calling the API, we had sent it using the data keyword. So that's why we'll have to extract the data using request.data variable. And as it would be in byte array format, which will be in binary format, we'll have to deserialize it. And the deserialization would be done using json.loadAs method. And I have imported JSON here, the module. So now news data here would be in the form of a dictionary variable, and the rest of the things are fine. I'm extracting the data in data article ID. I could not have done that. I could have used this news underscore data directly here, but I'm using this because I'm returning this data variable. Okay, then I'm using this put underscore item API provided by DynamoDB, and this is the syntax that DynamoDB has. I'll have to mention the table name and individual records. So now the record would be inserted using this put item API, and if the insertion is successful, there would be a message sent, and at the same time, if the breaking news flag is Y, then I'm calling this upload breaking news function, which will put the record in Redis database using the key as article channel ID and article published at, and then it would return data. Now to call this, I have created report news, and it is pretty straightforward. It is the front end API. I'm importing the requests library and the JSON library. Why requests library? Because using the request library, I'm using the put method and calling this URL endpoint. The reason I'm using put method, because add news articles is allowing only put method. So I'm calling this add news articles, and then I'm passing the data by serializing it using json.dumps method, and I'm checking if the return code is 200. If yes, then it's fine. If not, then I'm returning this error. Okay, so now what will I do is that let's test this individual code. I have copied this in EC2 instance. Let me do that again. Just Control A, Control C and paste it here. This is not how you should do it. You should actually use CI/CD library to deploy the code in EC2 instance or ECS machines. but I'm not using that. So anyway, let me use copy paste. Okay, so copy paste is done. Now let me run the code, and this is how you run it. Python 3 add new article, add news articles.py. It is running in foreground, and you know how to run it in background. You could have used the Flask variable also use and Flask run command, or you could have used G unicorn as well, but I'm choosing not to do that. So it is running in port number 10002, and I'll be running this report news front-end API in my local machine, which is working, right? So I have executed this. Now let's use Postman. And in Postman, what will I do? I'll have to send the message. I'll have to call the API, which is running in my local machine. So that would be 127.0.0.1.8002 report news. And I'll have to send some data using HTTP body. And in Postman, you know how to send it. We can use this raw format, and the type can be text, JSON, HTML. I'll be using JSON. And this is the body. I'm sending this particular message, and let's mention the article published as to be today's date. Okay, so the breaking news is in here. Now what would happen if I send this? It would go and hit the API which is running on my local machine, that is reportnews.py, and reportnews.py would call the API which is running on the EC2 instance, AddNewsArticles.py, and it would be inserted in the DynamoDB table. First, let us see whether this record is there in the DynamoDB table or not. And to do that, go to DynamoDB. This is the table, and click on Explore Table Items. And here select Query and mention the article published at date and the article channel ID, which is this one actually. Okay, and if I run, there are no items, but if I run the API, this item should be added here, but not in the in-memory database because breaking news flag is n. Let me send it, and it says method not allowed. Okay, so I'll have to use put method. Let's see. Okay, the news reporting is done, so it should have been added in DynamoDB table. Let's run this query again, and I should be able to see one record. So this is the record that has been added. Let's add one more record, and this time I'll be sending a different record with the breaking news flag as yes, so that it is added to the Redis database or in memory database. Now let me send this, and if everything is fine, it says that it has been added, and it has been added in memory database also. I cannot show you that it has been added because I cannot access Redis Elasticache from my local machine. So it has been added, and we have implemented the report news and add news articles, which is this part. This is report news and this is add new articles. If it is breaking news, then it will be added to the in-memory database. If not, it will add or insert to DynamoDB. And by the way, if it is breaking news, it will add to DynamoDB table and the in-memory database. So the first API is done. We are pending with read news articles, and breaking news. These are the three APIs that we are pending with. Now let me go ahead and create this read news articles, which would be reading from DynamoDB table and an external news API also, provided we send the date or the date and the channel ID.